Everybody calls him a geographer. So I guess he's a geographer. Hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Balckwellbooks. My name is Balkwell, and this is Balckwellbooks, and I'm here today on Balckwellbooks to talk to you about a book. The book today is Dersu the Trapper by Vladimir Klavdievich Arseniev. Vladimir Arseniev was a quite prolific Russian ethnographer and geographer in the early 20th century, and he wrote many sort of scientific books. This one is less scientific and is instead a memoir of his travels in northeastern Manchuria between the years 1902 and 1910, sort of surveying the land as an agent of the Russian government. This book is something of a classic in Russia, and in fact was made into a movie during, I believe, the 1970s called Dersu Uzala, a Russian movie directed by the Japanese director Akira Kurosawa, which is in fact a fantastic movie, quite a brilliant film. And that's how I found out about this book, is on my third time watching it. I noticed during the credits that it was in fact based on a memoir, and I said, wow, I bet that's not available in English. And then it turned out it was, and in fact it's been translated into English 3 different times. So the book that I read, the version I read, is one of those. And what separates Dersu the Trapper from, I guess, many other books, or what makes Dersu the Trapper unique and interesting, is of course the character of Dersu Uzala, who is an indigenous guide that Arseniev meets on his travels, and who sort of acts as Arseniev's mediator between him and this new environment that he finds himself in. The boreal forest, also known as the Taiga of northeastern Manchuria, is quite an inhospitable place if you don't know what you're doing. I mean, Arseniev knows what he's doing, but he doesn't know what he's doing quite as much as Dersu Uzala does. Obviously, it's very cold, it's very wet. There are many extreme weathers that can occur while you're there. There are dangerous creatures lurking in the shadows, etc., etc. So Arseniev encounters this man, Dersu Uzala, and the two form an immediate bond of friendship. And their friendship is sort of the driving force of the novel. Now, I'm going to call this book a novel, even though it purports to be a memoir. And in fact, on the cover of my edition, it says a true account by VK Arseniev. A very tiny amount of research, using the powers that we have nowadays, reveals that there are many discrepancies between the account we find in Arseniev's diaries and journals and sort of official documents of the time, and this book, which was composed for public appreciation, public enjoyment, right? Most memoirs really contain much untruth about them, much sort of manipulation of events and timings and such, because, memoirs, they're a way of telling the story of your life. And when you tell a story about something and you want the story to mean something to people, you want it to feel like it has a certain amount of coherence to it. You want it to have sort of narrative structure and thematic resonance. you have to change a lot, because people's lives, as they are, the sort of strict data of someone's life, does not have much thematic content, or at least not much comprehensible thematic content. And so it only makes sense that we must change things. So I generally consider memoirs to be novels based on true experiences rather than nonfiction, and it's just feels like a much. It allows me to understand these books much better, I feel. So with Dersu the Trapper specifically, what we find out is Dersu Uzala himself was not actually there for all the events in this book that he participates in. He acted as Arseniev's guide during one of the several expeditions that take place, or that are accounted for in this novel. But much of the story between them has been modified in ways that, frankly, it makes it a better story. However, what this does mean when we consider this as a novel, it sort of changes our relationship with Arseniev, or rather Arseniev's relationship with the book. When you're presenting a so-called true account, when you're offering a sort of non-fiction account of something that has happened or of things that exist, there's the expectation, or you're taking on the posture of a strict observer, that you are telling us what you've seen, and your perspective, as much as is possible, is meant to be left sort of to the wayside. However, when you're writing a novel, this is quite a bit different, because now, rather than being a lens or a sort of camera looking at the world, you are now the creator of this world. You're the creator of this story. And Arseniev is very much the creator of this story that he tells us, and the world that he depicts. So what sort of world is this that he depicts? Well, like I mentioned before, it's somewhat of an inhospitable place relative to many other places you can live in the world. And Manchuria is at the frontier of a few different, a couple different empires, and is a location inhabited by many different kinds of people. So, of course, Arseniev is Russian. He's coming there as a Russian for the Russian government. Who he encounters there, obviously there are the indigenous people. Dersu himself is a Goldie, as they was back then. They were known as Goldie by the Russians, which turns out to be a bit of a misnomer, and nowadays they are referred to as Nanai. So we have Dersu is the only representation of the Nanai in the book. If you look at the journals, Dersu actually had a brother and other members of his family. In the book, he's alone. His family is all dead from smallpox, and I'll get into that a little bit later. Aside from Dersu, we also have the Udahe or Udige villages that Arseniev comes across. We have Solon people, and on top of that, there are quite a few Korean villages. From what I can tell, the reason for this is that during the late 19th century, the northern part of the Korean peninsula was suffered a series of natural disasters that caused many people to move further north and have now settled in Manchuria, now being the time of the book, not right now, as I speak. Aside from this, we have, of course, Chinese people. Now, the Chinese are sort of the outgoing empire in the area. The sort of incumbent empire that is being sort of pushed out by the Russians. And what we find in the sort of depiction of the Chinese people that we encounter in this book, for the most part, they are operating within an imperial framework. They are landlords, and they are exploiting the indigenous people for their labor, putting them into bonds of debt, of unquantifiable debt, that no one even keeps track of it because it's so much debt that it basically turns the indigenous people into indentured servants. The Chinese are there for fur, animal hides, stuff like this, and also ginseng, which apparently Manchurian ginseng is the best ginseng you can get if you're ever in the market for ginseng. Now, Arseniev is quite reasonably quite critical of the sort of Chinese practices here and the sort of atrocities and the oppression that is inflicted by the Chinese people in the book. However, we must take a little bit of time to consider who Arseniev is working for and what his perspective is here. Obviously, in a strictly sort of moral sense, we can easily sympathize with what Arseniev is telling us about what is happening. However, we have to remember that often the most harsh, most vocal critics of empire, of imperial projects, are people who want to set up their own empire where the empire they are criticizing is set up. And if you've read any accounts of British travelers during the expansion of the British Empire, the way they describe Spanish rule, you will know that this is the case. Obviously, this doesn't downplay or this does not mean that the accounts are untrue, but simply that there is a sort of propagandistic reason for these to be presented in such a novel, because the Russians are performing this exact same type of colonialism, these exact same practices, committing atrocities of their own all throughout Siberia and much of the land that Russia now controls, and even in Manchuria have done so. And of course, Arseniev is presenting the Chinese oppression as a justification for Russian involvement in the area. Whether he means to be doing this or not, this is what he's doing. And he can pretend he's just a dispassionate scientist all he wants, but this is the function. This is the sort of external function of what he's doing. And we see this sort of Russian perspective of Arseniev sort of operating in a sort of complex relationship with his own moral intentions. And that's sort of much of the, not explicit conflict of the book, but that's the conflict that we might feel reading the book. When we think about Dersu Uzala himself, now I mentioned before, Dersu Uzala is a modified character, so basically a fictional character based on people that Arseniev had met. And it's hard to ignore the fact, even if you love the book, like I do, and love the relationship and the friendship between Arseniev and Dersu, consider it a beautiful thing, which I think it is, and believe Arseniev to be well-intentioned and honest in his respect and admiration for Dersu Uzala, in his knowledge of the environment he lives in. Obviously, as a hunter, and especially working alone as he does, he needs to be incredibly knowledgeable about the animals of the forest, their tendencies, be able to tell by tracking what they're doing whether they're healthy or unhealthy, what sort of animal he's traveling after, and also being knowledgeable about weather patterns, so when it's going to blizzard and you need to set yourself up to not die in a blizzard. At the same time, it's hard to ignore the fact that Dersu Uzala does contain elements of the sort of noble savage trope that is very common across sort of frontier literature or exploration literature of the 19th, and this is early 20th century European literature, and the sort of fundamentally European perspective that Arseniev brings to the tragedy of Dersu Uzala's position in the world. Dersu is presented as a sort of last of his people, as a person whose way of life is disappearing. And the reason his way of life is disappearing is because of Russian encroachment in the area. I mean, smallpox killed his family and much of the people he knew in the village that he lived, and smallpox was brought by Europeans. On top of this, the sort of urbanization and industrialization of the area by the Russians. They've constructed towns, the city of Vladivostok, and they're constructing railroads, through the forest, has meant that Dersu's relationship to the Taiga, the boreal forest, is no longer going to be possible in the near future. And Dersu, we see later in the novel, when he loses his eyesight and has to spend some time in a Russian village, is fundamentally incompatible with the Russian way of life, the urban Russian way of life, where one does not go out and collect firewood for oneself, or collect water for oneself, or anything like this, but it's instead, has to pay for these sort of resources and has to follow certain laws because of your, living in close proximity to people and living under these sort of social norms that Europeans expect, or that Europeans live within. Now, Arseniev is, of course, sympathetic to this tragedy, but of course, the tragedy is brought about by the colonial project of which he is an agent. And for the people back home reading this work, who are feeling this sort of catharsis of tragedy, for the people who feel bad about Dersu Uzala, there is a large element of hypocrisy here, because of course you're having your cake and you're eating it too. Not only do you displace these people, not only do you get access to the resources and the land, the resources of the land on which they lived, you now get the catharsis of feeling bad about it. So you win on all fronts by converting these experiences into this sort of tragic framework. It's still, even if there is the attempt to be sympathetic, it still is all operating in this European framework. And if you're interested in this kind of thing, Edward Said, the Palestinian writer and literary critic, has many essays on such topics, obviously relating to the displacement of Palestinians. You can't ignore this aspect of the novel. I mean, you can, if you want, and if you read reviews or read people talking about this book generally, or the film, people do ignore this, and they have their fun that way. But I think it adds an extra layer of complexity that actually makes the novel more interesting. At a surface level, this is a novel about friendship. It's about intercultural friendship. It's about people relying on each other in a harsh environment. Arseniev has to rely on Dersu for his very survival. Dersu saves him over and over again because Dersu understands the environment he's in. He's sort of, he inhabits it, whereas Arseniev is merely traveling to it and traveling through it. At the same time, the book has that sort of beauty of going into the wilderness. I mean, people who love to hike, people who love to camp, are going to get a lot out of this book. It's going to make you want to hike. It's going to make you want to camp, because you have that sort of connection with nature, going out into the forest and being at the whim of nature, and also learning through Dersu's knowledge how this sort of ecosystem works and how everything is interconnected, how everything is related, and the complexity of such an ecosystem, and how we as humans can operate within it in a way that isn't totally destructive and insane. So we have all of that, all of these very sort of positive themes, and it's a very enjoyable work, very interesting, very thrilling. I mean, there's plenty of action in the book, and surviving on a knife's edge. But at the same time, we have this aspect of Arseniev's perspective sort of barging into this world and bringing with him, or coming with, all this sort of interesting historical context. This book presents us with an area of the world that is at the frontier of these two empires I mentioned, the Chinese and the Russian, and is changing because of the changing fortunes of these empires at the time. And it is a place where many people live doing lots of different things and living in different ways, and it's quite fascinating to see such a world and the way that it operates, the way the people there need to rely on each other to survive. Even Dersu, who is solitary in his profession as a hunter, needs to rely on all these different people, to make his clothes, and to buy rifles, to buy bullets, to do all this trading. You need the support of other people to live in such a place, and if you want the support of other people, you need to support them in turn. So it's quite an interesting sort of ecosystem going on here. So all of this combined makes Dersu the Trapper just an incredibly fascinating book. And the movie Dersu Uzala is brilliant as well. The movie sort of compresses the narrative, as movies tend to do. I mean, that's what you have to do when you make a movie, because they're short. It compresses the narrative, emphasizes the friendship aspect a lot more, and adds elements related to that, and sort of cuts out a lot of other events. However, if you see the movie, and if you really enjoy, if you're really drawn to the environment, I mean, wonderful cinematography in the film, drawn to this environment and drawn to these characters, then Dersu the Trapper, the book, sort of offers a sort of slow burn version of that, where you really get to live in their shoes for a long amount of time. So, highly recommended book. Very interesting account of a area you might not really know about during a very interesting historical time. And you will learn a lot, not only about the environment, but about the people who live there, and the various forces at work in their lives. So that is Dersu the Trapper by Vladimir Klevdievich Arseniev. I'd like to thank everyone for listening to the show. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any thoughts or questions related to the book or the topics covered on this episode, or any episode of Balkwell's Books, I strongly encourage you to write into the show, balckwellbooks@gmail.com. is the email address balckwellbooks@gmail.com, or leave a comment on YouTube or on balckwell.online, which is my website, where I post generally nonfiction essays every 2 weeks. You can also find my novel, Only in Dreams, available on Amazon. Many 5-star reviews from happy readers of that book. The music for the show is by Max Miller, aka Funbill. Thank you so much for the music. And thank you, everybody, for listening to the show. Goodbye.